All right, today we're going to look at qualitative graphs again, and we're going to look at part two. This time around, we're not going to be graphing so much. We will be in class, but today we're going to be looking at the question, which graph is it? In other words, can we take a situation that we're given and ultimately match that up with a graph that's already been done up? So the key with this case is, again, making sure you know what you're measuring, as well as understanding the various nuances of each situation to see how does that play out in the graph. So let's read the first one. We'll kind of highlight or underline some important information, and then we'll see if we can match that up with the graph on the side. So it says Mr. Hunsaker started running a marathon as fast as he could. During the first few minutes, he gradually slowed down until he stopped about at the halfway point of the marathon. He had to take a long break sitting on a bench because he had run too fast. He then ran at a slower, constant speed until the end of the marathon, where he promptly collapsed. Which graph shows Mr. Hunsaker's distance run in terms of time? Let's look at the graphs. All of them seem to indicate distance over time, so how far he's gone over the course of the marathon. Now, one thing I noticed, it says that he started the marathon, all right? So in other words, he's at point 0. Well, if I look at A, B, and C, A is the only one that doesn't start at 0. So if we were thinking about potential choices here, either graph A, graph B, or graph C, it would seem that graph A doesn't work in this case. Notice it starts with some distance away, whereas graph B and C start at 0. All right, so A doesn't work right off the bat. So already starting off. Now it says during the first few minutes, he gradually slowed down. All right, so let's see, gradually slowed down. So at the beginning, I should see him coming to a stop. Well, notice for both B and C, it looks like he's going along at a decent pace, and then both show the distance not changing. So that could be an indication that he stopped. So far it would seem that B and C are mirroring the same ideas. So let's keep going. It says he had to take a long break sitting on the bench because he had run too fast. So again, that long break indicating that he indeed stopped. And notice both of these have about the same distance in terms of that stop, so still no good. It says he then ran at a slower, constant speed until the end of the marathon, where he promptly collapsed. So notice it says he's run at a slower, constant speed. Well, notice both of these are fairly steep to start, so we need to be looking at something that's maybe not as steep going forward. Well, if we look, B has that constant speed, and definitely not near as steep as it was before, but C does something weird. Notice his distance, he's running away from the starting line, and this has him running back towards it. And according to what we have, it doesn't necessarily mean that he starts and stops at the same spot. Notice this continues to go away and then finally stops, whereas this would indicate maybe a second stop along the way that wasn't actually given. So C is out, B is in, so it would appear that B is Mr. Hunsaker's situation. So we'll go ahead and write his name beside that. So this is Mr. Hunsaker's run. And again, we consider where he started fast and gradually stopped. So this is his stop. Okay, we can see that he continued running at a slower pace. So this is when he was slower. And then finally when he ends. All right, and notice his distance doesn't change anymore. He has stopped running. All right, let's try the other two and see if we can match them up. So again, A, B, and C, and I'm going to take a wild guess here that for Mr. Moss, B is not going to be the answer we're going for. So we can go ahead and eliminate that. So let's see what it says. Mr. Moss started at a friend's house and began walking home. After a few blocks, he realized he forgot his cell phone and hurried back to his friend's house to pick it up. After grabbing his phone, Mr. Moss immediately began running back home because he was afraid he was going to be late. Unfortunately, he got stuck for a little while trying to cross the busy street. After crossing the busy street, he decided to walk the rest of the way home instead of running. Which one shows Mr. Moss's distance from home in terms of time? Now notice this one. This was just distance run. This one is distance from home. So we're going to have to keep that in mind. All right, well, let's take a look. Going back and rereading, it says he started walking home. Well, both of these show distance walking. So, okay, so far so good. But then here's the key part. After a few blocks, he realized he forgot his phone and went back. So whatever distance he's traveled, we're going to have to travel that distance in reverse. In other words, he's going to go back to the starting point. Well, if we look at A, he started at a set distance, went, and then hurried back. Well, notice how much steeper this is, and it goes back to that same distance. And remember, we're looking at distance from home. So he was a long way from home, got a little bit closer, had to turn back and went back to that same distance he was away. Notice for C, we don't really get that. We see that he went away from home, but then stopped. Or went away, or went towards home rather, and stopped. Well, that really doesn't make sense because this would be his return trip, and it doesn't show him leaving again. So let's look at A, and we'll continue it all the way through. So it says, after grabbing his phone, he began running back again. So he ran back to the friend's house. Now he's running away from the friend's house, trying to get home. And notice what it says. He got stuck for a little while trying to cross the street, which means his distance would have remained unchanged. So notice his distance from home. Here he's really far away. Here he's at home. He's about midway. And notice what it says after that. He then decided to walk, all right, which means he's going at a slower pace. So notice this line isn't near as steep as, say, this line when he was running. So it would seem that A is for Mr. Moss and his cell phone situation. So let's take a look. That makes A for Moss. C didn't work. So let's look down here for Mr. Lamar. Again, we've got choices A, B, and C. And again, I'm going to take a wild guess here. Since A was for Mr. Moss and B was for Mr. Hunsaker, I'm going to take a wild guess here and assume that I'm the last one. But let's double check just to make certain. It says Mr. Lamar needed to put gas in his car. All right. He drove straight to the gas station and put gas in the car. On his way home, Mr. Lamar stopped at Taco Tuba because copyright laws exist to pick up dinner. Once he collected the food, he drove the rest of the way home. Which graph shows Mr. Lamar's distance from home over time? Well, notice this situation. If this is my distance from home, if I'm here at the origin, that means I'm at the house, which sure enough, based on this situation, it says I started off going to the gas station to get gas. So I've left home, gone, and here I am at the gas station. Notice my distance from home doesn't change here because I'm sitting there at the gas station. It then says on the way home, so notice I'm traveling back again. It says I make a stop at Taco Tuba to pick up dinner. So here we are getting tacos and then travel the rest of the way home. Cool. So I started at 0 distance from and end at 0 distance from. So this one seems to make sense. So good. So this is mine, Mr. Lamar's, we'll say Mr. Lamar's ride. All right. So this is the kind of thing that we'll be doing today. I'll give you situations, and then you have to match it up with the graph, making sure you can pinpoint each of those situations. Now, to give us some practice in this, here's what I've done. I've created a couple more graphs here on the back. I've got a situation that we're going to read through and see if we can pick apart the situation and know what part is where. So take a look. In this first one, I've got number of students, in this case, number of students sitting in the cafeteria, or going into the cafeteria, rather, over the course of time. We're told in this case that Mr. Rarick was monitoring the cafeteria at the start of lunch. Below are descriptions of what happened, labeled with a letter. Write the letter next to the portion of the graph that best matches that description. All right. So let's read through the descriptions first, and then we'll see what we've got. But looking at the graph, it would appear that so many students were there, a few more came in. Some students obviously stayed, right? We gained students, then whatever that number is, it stayed the same. Gained some more students, stayed the same. Looks like we gained a bunch of students here, much more so than we did the first go around. And then it looks like we lost maybe half of them. I don't know. That stayed. Looks like we gained some students, kind of similar to what we did here. And then it looks like we lost a whole bunch of students again. All right, so let's see what we can figure out. It says Miss Davis's class leaves the cafeteria. All right, well, that looks like maybe just one class's worth, so we'll see if we can find something like that. Mr. Moss and Mr. Lamar's classes leave the cafeteria, so that would be 2 classes leaving. All right, we'll think about that. Miss Davis and Mrs. Davis, that should be Mr. Sams. Mrs. Sams doesn't work in our building. She works over at Centerfield. That's a typo. Oh, well, Mrs. Sams, we'll say. Maybe she's subbing for Mr. Sams today. Their classes both enter the cafeteria together. Right? Mr. Rarick arrives and finds one class already in the cafeteria. Mr. Lamar's class enters the cafeteria, and then a few minutes later, Mr. Moss's class enters the cafeteria. Right? Miss Davis's class returns to the cafeteria. All right, well, let's see what we can pinpoint. First one that I noticed is that E, Mr. Lamar's class enters the cafeteria, and then a few minutes later, Mr. Moss's class enters the cafeteria. as well as when Mr. Rarick arrives, he already found one in. So not much time has passed. He's watching lunch and already one class is there. So I'm going to say that this part is D. Notice that when he walked in, there was already some people in the cafeteria. So we've got D figured out. But then it says other classes entered. And in this case, it says Mr. Lamar's class enters and Mr. Moss's class is entered a few minutes later. So this could be my class, and then this could be Mr. Moss's class. So from about here to here, we'll say that this is for E. All right, my class enters, then Mr. Moss's class enters. So two classes entered together. Check. But notice also, that differs from C. This says my class entered, so one class in, and then a second class a few minutes later. But notice for C, it says Miss Davis and Mrs. Sams. So again, we'll assume Miss Sams is filling in for Mr. Sams. Those entered at the same time. Well, notice how much steeper, more students all at once. So I'm going to say that this portion right here is C. All right, that both groups enter together. Know how steep that is? We've doubled the number of students that typically come in the same period of time. But then notice a group of students leaves. And in this case, we're showed that Mrs. Davis's class left the cafeteria. Maybe they went too early or something. So let's mark that. So that would be A. Check that off. But then it says a few minutes later here, it says Mrs. Davis's class returned. So maybe they went to lunch maybe a little early, and then, of course, they came back. So from here to here, we would have F. Make that A a little clearer. There we go. We've got F at that point. Cool. Which then leads us to the final bit. Mr. Moss and Mr. Lamar's classes leave. And notice here we've got two classes leaving together. So that would be B. From about here to here. Good. So notice how we marked off each point. We read through it all, marked off each bit, and that made it easy. So that way we could see what went where. And notice I went ahead and read that graph first just to get an idea of what was happening before we got into specifics. Let's try it one more time. All right. Uh-oh, out of focus. See if it'll zoom back in there for us. There it goes. So let's try it one more time. This is actually a true story here. Mr. Lamar's trying to mow his lawn. This happened this summer. Below are descriptions of what happened, labeled with a letter. Write the letter next to the portion of the graph that best matched with the description. So I've got area left to mow. So I'm starting off, looks like, with a lot of area to mow. And then if we went all the way down here, we'd have nothing left to mow. So the yard's done over the course of time. So let's read each situation. But before we do that, let's look at the graph. So it looks like I've mowed a little bit. Maybe I stopped for some reason, mowed a little more. Looks like I stopped for a longer period of time. And then it looks like this part of the graph is steeper. Notice these are a little bit more shallow. So maybe I've picked up the speed. And then it looks like I didn't actually finish mowing the grass. It looks like I've stopped again for some reason. So we'll see if we can't find something in here that matches up. So A, Mr. Lamar stops to pick up a tree limb that fell in the yard. All right, part B, Mr. Lamar sees a storm cloud and starts mowing at a faster rate. Part C, it starts to rain, so Mr. Lamar stops mowing for the day. Part D, Mr. Lamar is mowing his grass at a constant rate. And then E, Mr. Lamar ran out of gas, so he had to run back to the garage and get more fuel. Well, I noticed a couple of things here. I noticed that I stopped numerous times throughout the day. Let's think about each time and about how much time it would take. One of them is for the limb that I stopped. One of them is for running out of gas. And then the other one is that I ultimately stopped for the day. Well, let's look at C. If I stopped for the day, that seems the best match down here, because notice I stopped at this point, but immediately started mowing again. Here I also stopped, but again, immediately it would appear I started mowing again. This is the only one that indicates I never started mowing for a final time. So I'm going to let this right here, this part of the graph, be C, that it started raining, so I stopped mowing for the day. Cool. Well, let's think about these other two. If a limb fell, I could have simply stopped mowing, gone around, picked the limb up, moved it, and then jumped right back on the mower, started pushing again. I can't remember what I was doing at that point. That should be a very short trip. And notice I've got a very, very, very short scenario there where I stopped. So more than likely, this little stretch is A, and this longer stretch is E. This actually did happen. I had to get up off the riding mower because I completely ran out of gas. Didn't realize that I had done it, but I had. So we can mark that, and E. Check it off. All right. Now, I've got two left. Let's see what it says. Mr. Lamar sees a storm cloud and starts mowing at a faster rate. And then D, Mr. Lamar is mowing his grass at a constant rate. Well, the faster bit, I think we can clearly see here. So yeah, once I put gas back in the car, I realized, oh no, I looked up, the storm's coming, I better get going. So this would seem from where E stops and C starts that B is the best fit there. Notice I've got two stretches left for D, and this probably would be best to put in both. I'm mowing at a constant rate here and at a constant rate here. Cool. So constant rate, stop to pick up the limb. Constant rate, stop to get gas. Faster rate, trying to beat the storm. And then C, I ultimately stopped for the day. I didn't end up beating the storm. So this is the kind of work that we're going to be doing in class today. Can we take the situation and then match it up with the graph, or see what part of the situation matches up with the graph? We'll still be doing some drawings today, but again, our focus won't be on that. Our focus will be more on picking apart the situation and making sure that the graphs we're given actually match the situation. If you have any questions or concerns, please bring them with you to class and we'll talk about it. Otherwise, guys and gals, you have a good day.